Alright, so today I'm going to be presenting on the effects of the printing press on the English language. I'm going to try to keep this as brief as possible because I've got a lot to cover and a lot that I've got to present today. So I'm just going to start out real briefly giving you a thesis of what this is about. So I'm not going to read this word for word, but basically what I'm going to be going over is outlined in these different works over here. So I'm going to be talking about how, we're not going to follow that. So there are four main things that I'm going to be going over. The ways that the printing press affected the letters of the English alphabet that are used, the English grammar, the orthography of the English language, and then I'll be going over just briefly some of the pros and cons of manuscripts versus the printed word. I assess the effects of the printing press on the English language to be very big, especially due to those three main points: letters, grammar, and orthography. Just getting into it, I think. I guess before we start, to make it feel a little bit more like a thesis, I guess I'll just start off by saying English, it's a language that has its roots not in Latin, but in, its original roots, not in Latin, but in Germanic languages. And due to its neighbors, it took on a lot of different changes, but a lot of those changes, they ended up getting solidified by the development of the printing press, mostly because the way that a lot of these texts were distributed with the printing press, they were able to be distributed a lot more widely. And so when the people that, were in contact with the people that developed the printing press and were running them and able to pay for the provisions of paper and ink and all of these things, those people were able to define what the English orthography would look like, what the grammar would be in spelling books and things like that. And to some extent the letters, but actually that, as we will get into later, was out of their control to some extent. But because of the ways that, not only the technical limitations of the printing press and the way that things are printed, but also because of the specific people who became people in power in charge of the English language, in charge of giving it its specific orthographic priorities and grammatical structuring, these things would not have been possible with just mere manuscript, with just scribes. These are all things that I see were necessarily related to the printing press. So for us to start, I think I'll actually start at the difference between manuscripts and print. So if we go down here first, so some of the pros and cons of manuscripts versus print. So manuscripts are basically documents that were handwritten, hand-inscribed by scribes. Very, self-explanatory word there, but basically people would have to spend, it was basically a whole career. You would learn to write well and to also be able to do the illustrations for a lot of the works that you were doing. So, the vast majority of scribes were basically copying machines. They did the work of either transcribing or transliterating works so that those could be, further preserved or disseminated to other people, which in and of itself is very inefficient. But yeah, basically some of the good things about the old system of manuscripts are basically that they're able to be more freely done. So the people that were writing them, to a certain extent anyways, they were able to do with them stylistically and linguistically what they wanted. And I guess more so than wanted, they were able to, without any restrictions, kind of include the flair of their time, the flair of their place. So the grammar being used in their time and place, as well as the script style and so on and so forth. Script here referring to the way that they wrote. I don't have perfect examples of this, but this thing with the scripts can be seen in the distinctions between different styles of script, such as black letter versus Elizabethan versus uncial and things like that. But yeah, so scripts, or we call them fonts these days, but they're slightly different because scripts are handwritten. They fluctuated naturally and they developed a lot and they evolved a lot. Whereas with the nature of fonts, with the nature of these different prints, especially back in the day, they were literally set in stone. These things were hard blocks of metal that were being used to print these things. They didn't change very often, and they didn't fluctuate so much because they were basically all created by factories and places that were centralized to certain areas. Not anybody could make a block of text, whereas any scribe has their own flair and their own regional influences as to how they're going to write their things. And then finally, unlike print, when you're writing and you're a scribe writing a document, you can write paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs and then include, kind of similar to this presentation, I guess. You can include an image that's just interspersed with the text, and then inside that image you can write your own text on top of it, and you can color your text and decorate it however you want. So we were able to get a lot more kind of flair with a lot of these works back then. Some of the negative things, like I said before, it's expensive and inefficient. So basically you're having to have a person spend a lot of time on each of these texts, which makes it harder to disseminate, and also is just not as effective in terms of these variations, as good as they are linguistically and looking at it scientifically, and the fact that diversity drives change and helps things to evolve more quickly. The fact that these weren't standardized and the fact that everything had its own version of things made legibility a lot harder, because people that were distanced from the writer in time or in place, they could have more trouble understanding the way the thing was written. Someone would probably have issue trying to figure out how to read this, in a few centuries from this period or something like that. So I'm just going to go over some examples here real quick of some manuscripts. So these two you can see is a good example of ornamentation. These are both biblical texts in, unfortunately, Latin. Actually, no, this one was in Belgian French, actually, but I know it wasn't. Yeah, these are both in Latin. But this is just an example of the kind of flexibility you have. You've got this creature over here, all this ornamentation around the letter D here and stuff like that. Here you've got an example of just your ability to kind of use whatever letters and things like that you'd like, as well as ligatures. So, and just odd symbols, you've got God, you've got the kind of backwards R here, just ligature central, trying to just combining all these different things. You've got the letter Yog right here for Yif. Just all sorts of things like that. And each individual back then had the power to use whichever letters they saw fit, which these days we have some ability to do that with just the flexibility of digital type. But even then, it takes a lot of time, especially if you're developing your own new letters, to establish your thing enough to get it into the digital sphere. But yeah, the letter Thorn is seen here as well as I don't know, there might be the letter Eth in here somewhere, but it just goes to show you can see that that letters, you could use whatever you wanted really, and there were no limitations because it's just whatever you're going to write. Here, these are two good examples too. So this one basically is a text that's a commonplace book, but it's not just for the individual. These were, as far as I know, these were published by the individual, but that's the thing, is that sometimes, well, there's two things here. So first off, you got multiple languages and layouts that you can use because you can do whatever you can with the pen, basically. So he can write in Greek here and Latin here. He could write in Chinese in the margins. He could do whatever he wanted. He could include images and a graph and whatever suited his fancy. Here you can also see this was a good example of a reason why people might not want to use a printing press, which would be, printing press is kind of an officialized process. You've got to find a printer and you've got to get authorization to print and you got to go through people, and it becomes a pretty highbrow thing to disseminate or to get something printed for dissemination. But here you can see this person wrote in manuscript partially probably because they don't want it to be known that they're practicing some sort of magic, or that they're noting down some magical practices or things like that. So obviously this kind of thing was probably considered heresy back then and things like that. So not only could they write in their own cryptic script if they wanted, but they can also use images like this. They can draw things like this without having to worry about repercussion quite as much. So we're going to go back and look a little bit at some prints as well. So here you can see some examples of some kind of a little bit of flexibility actually with print. This is not very common, and I think I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. So before I get into these examples of prints, we are going to talk about letters in English and the ways that they started to disappear. So very briefly, basically, English for a very long time used the runic writing system, which had certain letters that don't directly correspond with English letters. You've got letters like Ethel and things like, we had Win here, which was represented by another dead letter, and things like that. So, and this letter that kind of represented Ogham. And so you got, Thorn, like right there, and things like that. So yeah, we got letters like this here, these four at the end, and 3 of these 4 are all but dead now. And a big reason for that is that although, as we can see, even in print, it was still a thing to some extent, although this is talking about, the Saxon alphabet, but these letters started to die out. I'm not going to go too into detail here because, for the sake of time, but there's still some letters used in English these days, to this day, but a lot of them, the reason why a lot of these died off was because the printing press of the time, the Gutenberg printing press, was developed by the Germans, by Gutenberg. And although this is, I can't confirm that this is an exact character set of the letters that were able to be used, the letters that were available were limited to letters that were used in German and Latin, basically, and, possibly Greek. And so a lot of these letters that were being used commonly, like Eth and Thorn, slowly started to get phased out once the printing press became the most common way of writing things. And that started to spill over even into manuscripts. So people like Caxton here, even though this isn't a work that's being done on a printing press, you can start to see that things like the are starting to be spelled by people like Caxton with the TH, which is interesting. And part of the reasoning why that is, I will get to in just one moment. So part of the reason for that is Greek letters have been for quite a time spelled in Greek with an H. So, like the Greek letter tau, for example, the Greek or the Latin folks, the Romans thought that the Greek letter tau was a stronger T. Or actually, that's not a good example. Like the Greek letter R, it was aspirated. It was like r, that kind of thing. And it was more aspirated than the Latin R. And so they would write it as RH. And the same goes with the TH. TH was used to represent the letter, what's it called? The Greek letter that represents the TH sound, like the th sound. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but because of that, eventually once English got to this bypass where we weren't able to write letters like thorn and eth, those just started to get replaced by the letter th, just like we had been using for Greek words in Latin for quite a time. So theta, that's it, theta. So anyways, if we get back to letters, I will start to get into the ways that, we'll wrap up letters and then I'll move on to grammar and education. So the standardization of grammar and education, this was largely spearheaded by kind of noblemen who had connections to the king and the queen, right? So, and not just the king and the queen, but just noblemen in general. So, although back in the day, there were a lot of restrictions against English being used for religious things, eventually this started to let up a little bit, and things like the Lord's Prayer were allowed to be printed in English. And until then, that was an issue because a lot of things like the Lord's Prayer were included in alphabets and books like that, because it was one of the most, consequential pieces of literature that anybody needed, so they would include it in everything. But there was a ban against writing things like that in English. So up until the 1520s, things like this, Our Father which is art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, this kind of thing would have been, you could have been killed for that, which there was, I think it was Tyndale. I don't remember if it's written in here. Or maybe it wasn't Tyndale, but somebody wrote an English Bible and they were killed for it because although their intentions were good, it was seen as heresy back in the day. So slowly things started to change and alphabets were allowed to be written, including religious texts, and slowly you started to see people, especially William Lilly, used to see people start to make actual grammars for English. Now, the interesting thing about this is that English wasn't seen to have had a grammar by a lot of learned people at the time, because basically Latin had inflections. It had suffixes and prefixes and grammatical gender, and it had a lot of things that were like, I, handeth, that kind of thing. You had suffixes that you could affix to something to change the meaning, change the, time placement of the term or something like that, or the number of people or things like that. And that was considered to be grammar. And the fact that English didn't have something like that, to a lot of scholars at the time, that's the word, made people think that English just didn't have a grammar. And then on top of that, the fact that Latin was used for a lot of things and English wasn't, as well as the fact that there was, people had seen English to not have enough terms to express a lot of, high-level enlightenment, although this is pre-enlightenment, highly scholastic ideas and deep ideas. People thought that English just wasn't apt for things like this, and there was a lack of, English equality with Latin at the time. But people like Lilly here, they were able to establish ABC books, which were basically the elementary grammars of the time. And this was revolutionary because until then, English was basically just a collection of unregulated dialects in a region. And so the English of one corner of the country could be almost Gaelic, whereas the English on another other country could be practically Norman. So with this, you could start to see English within England slowly starting to standardize to the point where people within the nation would be able to have, inner intelligibility despite their distance from each other. So Lily's grammar, one of the things about it is that grammars by people like Lily at the time, they were based a lot on things like Latin grammar. So they used a lot of Latin terminology and things like that to talk about English, and they tried to fit English into a lot of the boxes that Latin was fit into. And that's not a huge issue necessarily, but it resulted in a lot of peculiar ways of describing English that made more sense in Latin. Getting a little bit off onto a tangent real quick, and I'll not go too deep into it, but one of the ways that English got this equality was the addition and embracing of Latin, as well as French, to a lesser extent, loanwords. So a lot of terms that didn't exist in English that only existed in Latin, they would just adopt those Latin terms. They would establish like a standardized spelling for it in English, just kind of taking off some of the affixes and suffixes, sometimes maybe, or suffixes and prefixes, and adapting them to English so that they could be used standardly in English. And that really helped English to get the kind of word inventory that it needed to really address a lot of the things that were trying to be discussed in English that, had been seen at the time to not be possible. Just to finish off the topic of letter death, there were some folks who actually tried to revive some of the letters that died with the printing press. And one of these was... I don't think they have his name written here, but I will just go to it. I think his name was Butler. Yes. So Butler here, he came up with, and I swear to goodness, I have this written somewhere else. One moment. The feminine monarchy. Oh, here we go. So Charles Butler, he made basically a reformist script that was trying to address a lot of these issues at the time of English not being, the spelling not really matching, and the fact that, a lot of letters were gone that he saw as were unjustly gotten rid of. At first it was for practical reasons because of the Gutenberg press, but eventually it was more than possible to write using these terms because England started to be able to print its own things, but nobody had really seen the need. So he developed in multiple scripts here. You got your standard Roman, your italic, and your black letter. He developed all these different letters that were trying to basically address these issues. So sounds like, double, like long vowels and things like that, as well as discerning things like the k sound and, esh, and the hua sound, and ch and the, stuff like that. He, although he didn't embrace the letter thorn, unfortunately, but yeah, he developed this script, which, in my opinion, is pretty legible. But basically, he was trying to revise it, and there were people trying to do things like this that were pushing against the embracing of this reduced alphabet inventory. As you can see, but we have in our language many syllables. Which having gotten a new pronunciation do yet retain their old orthography, for that their letters do not now rightly express their sound. So as you can see, it's pretty, it fits with, there's a lot more parity between the ways that things are pronounced and the ways that things are written, which is interesting. And I'll get back to orthography in just a moment while I finish off grammar. So one of the important works in grammar at the time was this book, The English Schoole-Maister by Edmund Coote. It doesn't want to load quite properly here. That's okay, we don't necessarily need the visual. So basically, here we go. As Howard Hill said here, basically, back in the day, when the printing press was in kind of its infancy, we had people writing their grammars and things like this, and writing dictionaries and grammars, but the interesting thing was, the people that were doing the printing, they weren't grammarians, they weren't linguists. A lot of these people, they were technicians. They were the people setting the type. This wasn't being done by the authors. It wasn't being done by these, scholars. And so sometimes we would have things in actual, grammar books where it would be defined, hey, this is how you spell this word, and this is how you use this grammar. And the actual printer not really, quite paying attention to that and having their own way of spelling things, their own grammar that they use. They would use their personal way of spelling things, in neglect, basically. And so oftentimes you would have authors having books that were being put out that had unwarranted, unapproved spellings of things, despite having defined those spellings in the very same book. And this isn't hypocrisy, it's mostly just an issue of, it's not them that are printing the work. It's almost like they're, doing speech to text, and the computer that's doing the speech to text is an uneducated typesetter. And here we can see also the English Schoole-Maister, the edition that I was showing here, it's spelled the English Schoole-Maister, but slowly, from 1596, slowly over the course of about 100 years, only 100 years, it went from what was quite a low percentage of modern spellings to up to almost 80%. So things were iteratively changing very quickly in this time because of the predominance of things like this alphabet book and elementary grammars and things like this. And some of these works, it was noted that this book, for example, was used so much that it was almost literally used to death, which probably shows that, as they noted, the scarcity of the books is explained by their heavy use. So basically, the fact that it was so heavily used makes it seem like not only was it popular, but also they were probably, there still weren't enough of them that they could be taken for granted, basically. I'm going to move on to spelling changes now, orthographic changes. So and as we, addressed earlier, as printers were able to start more widely, or was able to start providing books and works more widely to people that were carbon copy facsimiles of a work, they were able to start also developing systems of spelling, which were established in things like I just showed a moment ago, things like alphabets and grammars, but also things like dictionaries and all that. But the thing is, even before the dictionary, even before English was given the dignity of a dictionary, people like Chaucer and Caxton, for example, were establishing spelling norms just in their works. And so printers started to adopt spelling conventions and things like that almost out of a supply and demand need, because a lot of these works, it only made sense to follow the works like Chaucer and Caxton that were established already, that people had already known and read a lot. Following those grammar patterns and following those spellings so that the readers, the people that paid the money for these books, would be able to understand them properly. And this is where we get into a lot of the very interesting developments of the English language back in this time, because writers would make their own decisions on how they want to spell things, but as Bowen says here, basically there was this intentional choice that was made to not change the English orthography to be matching more the way things were spelled, or things were pronounced in what he calls the real language, but rather to go in the opposite direction. So a lot of words that were taken from French, for example, and from Norman French, they were given new spellings based on their Latin etymology, based on their original Latin spelling, or the spelling of the original Latin words, rather, sorry. So they were Latin words that came into English through French. So basically they were French words, and they would try to basically quote-unquote fix those words. And so words like the word debt, which today is spelled debt, was also spelled debt back in the day. It came through the French word debt, but we added in the B because the Latin word had a B. It was something like debitate or something like that. And there were a lot of words like that although they were pronounced one way and they were spelled that way initially by most writers that wrote English, once these works started to get standardized, the people that were standardizing them were scholars, or a lot of them were, and a lot of these scholars, but also it was noted, even non-scholars were getting on this bandwagon of, we need to make spelling match etymology, not the way things are pronounced. And so this is a huge turning point in the way that English is spelled, because until this point, some people would write etymologically because that was the only way that they knew how to write it. But a lot of people would also just spell things the way they sounded. They would spell debt like D-E-T, or, spell island I-L-A-N-D. And sometimes these changes actually happen in error, and sometimes that would result in the way things were being spelled changing in some way, pronounced changing in some way it wouldn't. So, for example, here, island, the word island, it was assumed back in the day when they were doing this big shift that island came from the French word isle, which includes an S, because, the French word isle means island. But actually, it was derived from an Old English word, Igland, and it basically means island. But this S was added to the English word island because of an assumed etymology, even though it wasn't the case. And in this case, the S in island, maybe it was just too much friction. It was just too hard to pronounce, maybe. Maybe that's the reason why that new spelling didn't enter the pronunciation, but a lot of words did end up following their new spelling. The pronunciation ended up following the new spelling. So I'm going to breeze over this real quickly because it's a lot of stuff. But these are just some examples of another thing, which is, well, to finish off that idea for real quick, because of the Latin spelling, the word language, it was originally pronounced and spelled in English langage, or language, because it came from the French word spelled about the same and pronounced about the same. But when they were doing this big shift, they saw that it was spelled that way, and they saw the Latin word lingua, which is the actual etymology of the true etymology of the French word. And so they added the G back into language, and eventually over time, as people start to, read things in books and learn through them, language became language based off of the spelling. The pronunciation started to follow the spelling. And we would have a lot of words as well. This is a separate topic, but words that we would have one word that came through French and one word that came directly from Latin. And oftentimes the word that came directly from Latin that, English borrowed directly back in the 1500s, such as fragile, it would keep the Latin spelling. So fragilis became fragile with the G, but because in France a lot of these G's weren't pronounced, the word frail was in English, and it stayed because they decided, the meanings have shifted enough to the point where the meanings of these two words are different. It's not a duplication, and so the same could be said about other things like sure and secure. They came from the same word, but because they were different enough, they kept both of them in English instead of just changing sure to include a C. But there are some examples where, writers would start to take words like sure, for example, and they would just start putting the more Latin spellings in there, despite the fact that they weren't pronounced that way. So even words that weren't mistakes, obviously, they would be spelled with new spellings that people weren't familiar with. And then here are just some more examples of mistakes that happened because of mistaken etymology. Scissors, for example, were conflated with a word that means to cut, but that was, not the right call. But despite that, the spelling stuck. Same with delight. It's a French loan word, but they assumed it was Old English or something like that because of the pronunciation. And same with crumb. They added a B, even though there was no reason to add a B, because it resembled another word that ended with a B. So all of this to say, the orthography of English changed a lot after the development of the printing press, mostly because a group of elites that had, or just scholars, a group of wealthy people who had connections to the people that were able to print, as well as probably connections to the nobles, they were the ones that determined, on one hand, the official spellings that would be developed, but on the other hand, you had to be a fairly wealthy and noble person to write a book that would become famous enough to get printed. So on either hand, the people that were developing the spellings that were happening now, a lot of them were making these arbitrary decisions that now that the printed word could be printed once and given to an entire country, basically, these decisions were able to make a huge impact and a very lasting impact. And a lot of these changes eventually became changes that still exist to this day in our English language. So I think to sum things up, basically, before the printed word, it took a long time to create a work, and although they were more flexible in what they could do, they didn't give to standardization and legibility, nor did they give to interintelligibility. And also, it wasn't a very efficient way to make a document. Once we started to be able to print things with the efficient Gutenberg press, which was not the first printing press, but was one of the most efficient that was able to, catch popularity, we were starting to be able to print things in a standardized format that was legible to far more people, and eventually even got the flexibility of being able to start, writing custom characters, custom scripts, and things like that. And so after the print took dominance, you would see these three things have major changes. So the letters used in the English language, the grammar and standardization of the English language from a set of basically, ruleless dialects to a standardized or a mostly standardized language, and then also changes to spelling and orthography. So, the conscious decisions to embrace etymology over pronunciation, as well as just the ways that, like I was talking about earlier, how the minor things such as technicians that were typesetting these books, the spellings and misspellings of those people could also catch on and become standardized spellings and things like that. Just like how scribes' manuscripts could have the same effect. But at the end of the day, the two main outcomes for orthography were that we kept this conservative etymology-based orthography, and also just orthography in general was standardized through the printing press, which would not have been, at the very least, would have been much more difficult with manuscripts. It would have taken a lot of executive action from the king and the nobles, and it would have been very difficult to, create facsimiles of these new ABC books and things like that fast enough and efficiently enough to disseminate them to the public and enforce them. So yeah, I hope this was a helpful primer on the ways that the printing press affected the English language. I hope it was clear enough, although it is surely not concise. We're running on 40 minutes, and I will resubmit this if it's too long. Thank you all, and if you watched all the way to the end of this, my condolences to your sanity. Thank you, and goodbye.